I want to talk about electromagnetic waves in the Quran. Now, electromagnetic waves is radiation, and radiation is energy which travels through space at a phenomenal speed in the form of waves. The sun emits radiation, warms and sustains the earth. If you want to understand waves, it's useful to visualize a rope that's fixed at the one end. So you can produce waves by injecting energy into the system. That you can do by rhythmically shaking the rope. And by doing this, you're creating waves. Now, the number of waves per second is known as the frequency. If you shake the rope at a leisurely pace, the frequency will be low and the waves will be drawn out. And the wavelength is the distance between two wave crests of adjacent waves. Now, if you shake the rope at a more vigorous pace, you'll find that more energy is injected into the system and the frequency will go up. In other words, the number of waves per second will increase and the wave will be compressed. In other words, the wavelength will become shorter. Commentators of the Quran that don't have a good background of this kind of knowledge, what they've struggled with this verse, and given all sorts of interpretations. One group considered this to refer to human beings that spread the truth, which doesn't actually fit the context. And then those who believe that it refers to the forces of nature. For me, inspired by Abdul Wadud, is the author of The Phenomena of Nature. He translates this as electromagnetic waves. And I find this to be the best translation. Now, it was only in the last 2 generations that the nature of electromagnetic waves was uncovered. Yet the Quran declared in the 7th century about electromagnetic waves. It makes the following statement. This is a quotation 77, 1, 2, 3, 4. Consider the electromagnetic waves which are sent forth one after the other, propagated through consecutive progression, moving along as a large force at a phenomenal speed in the form of agitations, spreading far and wide, and are distinctly separate, imparting information which is preserved. And you find the Quran gives us here a general picture of electromagnetic waves. That is, it's repetitive and it's wave-like nature. Of course, the word electromagnetic doesn't appear in the Quran, but as we go along, you'll see that the Quran describes its essential features. And what we'll do is we look at the individual phrases and then discuss them as we go along. Now, firstly, the Quran speaks about moving along at a phenomenal speed in a form of agitations and flowing with ease. Traditionally, light, which is a form of electromagnetic radiation, has been considered to have a wave-like nature. It was only in the 20th century that it was realized that light actually has a dual nature, that it can also act as particles. These particles are called photons. And these photons, they don't have a mass. This quality of being massless allows them to travel at a maximum yet finite speed. Already in the 7th century, the Quran was informing mankind of the incredible speed of light, but yet finite. In the case of the word speed here, the singular form is used because there's different types of electromagnetic wave, but they all move at the same speed in vacuum. It was also recently realized that, light has an electromagnetic character. In other words, a light wave consists of oscillating electric and magnetic fields. They oscillate at right angles to each other. So thus you have a setup of a changing electric field, which gives rise to a changing magnetic field, which causes a changing electric field, and so on. And the result is electromagnetic disturbances, which flow in the form of agitation as described in the verse. And just something I forgot to say is that In the understanding of light consisting of photons, in this understanding, a beam of light consists of a large number of photons. Now, it was also said in the verse that it contains a large force. So we know that radiation is a form of energy. It contains large amounts of it. Energy and force in this regard may be considered intimately linked. Then it says spreading far and wide. Now, as the light leaves or is emitted from the light source, you find that the light at that particular location there's a narrow band. But as it moves away from the light source, it spreads out, scatter, as the Quran puts it. And this is one of the essential features of electromagnetic waves. Now, lastly, the Quran says that they are distinctly separate. Now, we find that there's different types of electromagnetic waves, but they can all be identified, precisely. But in order to do this, we have to just introduce another verse, chapter 103, verses 1, 2, and 3. It says there, by the progression of time. In other words, time moves in a forward direction. If you consider again chapter 77, verses 1, 2, and 3, the Quran describes not a single, but a series of waves. In other words, one wave is following the other and following the other. In other words, there's a time lapse between two waves. So you have the setup, therefore, of a number of waves proceeding over a time interval. And this is basically what frequency is, the number of waves per second. In order to qualify as frequency, the frequency needs to be constant. That can be derived from the last part of chapter 77. In the end of this passage, it says, imparting information which is preserved. Although the light is coming from the furthest corners of the universe, they maintain their frequency. In other words, they retain their characteristics. Each set of waves has a unique set of frequencies. And that is why, in other words, the frequency is constant. And that's why they are distinctly separate. And that is why we can derive precious, useful information from the waves, like galactic distances, the composition of stars, the velocity of stars, and so on. Now, we see therefore in conclusion that the Quran describes the essential characteristics of electromagnetic waves. Some say I'm reading too much in the verse. It's probably about water waves. But now, why would a citizen of Arabia surrounded by desert sand give a scientific description of water wave when the science of water only took off in the 19th century with the development of turbines? Even if it's about water wave, the knowledge is still futuristic. In any case, characteristics like moving at a phenomenal speed, imparting information which is preserved, are distinctly separate. These can only apply to electromagnetic waves.